Is he
Robert, you there?
Is the connection got lost?
Hello?
Hi.
Okay.
Okay,
I'm just
good.
going to move your speakers.
Maybe there.
How's that? We're going to see if you can hear people. Let's start.
Okay, so we're going to start. Can you hear us well, Robert?
Just a touch louder.
Okay, we'll try.
That's perfect.
Maybe also when you speak, David, we can move this there. Okay, great. So I want to welcome you all to the dissertation defense of the Treleaven, and I'm really happy today to have this event with David's masterful work, and I want to thank you for coming here to accompany David. What I would like to do first is to introduce the committee members, and then I'll say a few more words, and then we'll give the baton to David for his presentation. And then there will be questions and answers from the committee members, and there will be a time also for questions and answers with the audience from you. So I want to introduce first our external member. Is Robert Masters. He's on conference call. He's a doctor in psychology. He's director of the Masters Center for Transformation. I think that you are now in Oregon. Is that right, Robert?
Yes, I'm now American. I moved to Ashland. I was originally from Canada.
Yeah, I knew you were in Vancouver, and then I heard from recently that you moved to Oregon, so
yeah.
Welcome to the States.
I like it. Thank you.
For those of you who are not familiar with Robert, he's a group leader, he's a body worker, he's a teacher of integral spiritual growth, and I think that he's most well known by his written work. His many books include The Way of the Lover, Darkness Shining Wild, and his two most recent books are Spiritual Bypassing, that you can find it in the CI's library, in the shelves there, and I think in the windows, as well as Transformation Through Intimacy. So, Robert, is there anything else you would like to say about yourself as a way of introduction?
I think that's about it. I mean, my two passions are writing. I've got a book, Transformation Through Intimacy, revised edition, just coming out next week. I've got some contracts from some workbooks on emotion and shadow. But my primary love is my work. I love working with people at a very deep level. So I was especially drawn to David's work because I'm working with trauma almost daily with people. And I incorporate deep emotional work, body work. It's very integral, it's very intuitive. So I was especially drawn to his topic.
Great, thank you. So second committee member is the Don Johnson, that I think needs almost no introduction here at CIS, but he's the founder of the Somatics programs, as well as the founder of Somatics as a discipline. He still teaches at CIS, thanks. We're very blessed still to have him, and he teaches a groundbreaking class that is called Phenomenology of the Body, that many of you in the East West Department has taken. Has been also a member of the Center for Theory and Research in Esalen for many years, having together a number of conferences, editorial board of the journal Somatics, and also the author and editor of many books and anthologies, including Body, Recovering Our Sensual Wisdom, Body, Spirit and Democracy, and also his personal memoir, Everyday Hopes, Utopian Dreams, Reflections on American Ideals. So, and then myself, I'm Jorge Ferrer, and I'm the department chair here in East West Psychology. And in addition to writing, also books and editing stuff on religious studies, transpersonal psychology, I also have a long-term interest in the intersection of spiritual practice and somatics and body-oriented healing. So this is also what drew me to David's work. But I forgot to ask you if you want to add anything else about yourself.
No,
later. Sorry, Don.
That's fine.
Yeah. So, okay. So just before asking you the baton and going for your presentation, I just want to say a few words about dissertation defense. This is like a public event, and therefore it's also like a participatory event. Your presence here is important. It's like part of what is making this rite of passage happening, and this is, this is a rite of passage for David. He's at the edge of crossing an important threshold for which he has been preparing himself for many years. So it's really an important moment, and I would like to invite you to be here as present and mindful as you can be, to accompany David through this threshold with your presence and mindfulness and appreciation and positive good thoughts. So let's make this a communal event, even if David is the man of the day. So without any other word, David, you can proceed.
Thank you. I'll move this up.
Please.
It's really packed. So, hi everyone. Welcome. When I first imagined this event happening a couple years ago, I thought it would be maybe the two of us and my mom on a conference call. So I'm really humbled and honored to have a full room. It's like I've been in front of the computer for a couple years now, and this is such a dream to be able to present to a full room. I want to begin with thanking the committee, who has been fantastic through the last couple years. They've just been totally present with me, really engaging, respectful. Jorge especially has been a complete superhero, turning around work really quickly, and you've just been huge support to me, so thank you. Ishtar Kramer is not here, and Ishtar's been also a superstar for me the last week. She's very sick right now, but she changed the room and got this camera, and so she's been also great. And there's a bunch of people here from CWS, is that right? I'd love to see who you all are. Thanks for coming. I've never met Catherine Lee. Is she here? Hi, Catherine. Thank you. So I'm really glad you're all here. Catherine wrote me a week ago and said, we're having our department meeting, I guess, over this time. Could we come to the first half of the presentation? And I said, yes, that'd be great. And I'm also really happy to have a couple people here from different parts of my life all coming together. So it's really exciting. Jorge was encouraging me this last week to really make this a rite of passage. And I've been thinking the last couple of days especially that there's a lot of death happening for me in this moment. Like I'm letting go of, for I guess 12 years now, I have called myself a student. And I'm finally letting go of a place that I've held in the world. And in that, two important people have died for me over the last couple of years during this degree in the writing of this presentation. Writing of the dissertation. One is my grandfather. His name's Alan. That's my middle name. And I would not have even been able to be in California without him. So I want to presence him. And many of you know Andrew Ratti, who he passed away just before the new year. And I know Andrew would have been here like front row with the Toronto Blue Jays cap on, beaming and being really proud of me. And he would have had probably like a 3-page love letter to give to me after, maybe 5. So, I want to presence him as well. And finally, there's been a birth. My good friend Zane had a baby girl, Ishel, over the course of this dissertation. So there's been birth as well as death, and I want to presence her as well. Okay, the title of my dissertation, which we'll talk about later, is Meditation and Trauma, a hermeneutic study of somatic experiencing and the Western Vipassana movement. Somatic experiencing is a psychotherapeutic approach to healing trauma, and it was developed by Dr. Peter Levine in 1997. He's quite famous for a book that came out, Waking the Tiger. It's exploded as a really popular movement to healing trauma, not just with psychotherapists, but with other practitioners. The Western Vipassana movement could be colloquially known as Spirit Rock here in the Bay, Insight Meditation Society. The most famous teachers of this movement would be Jack Kornfield, Sylvia Boorstein, Joseph Goldstein. It's a particular thread of Western Theravadan Buddhism as it's been expressed in the West. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with hermeneutics, I am basically, this is my drawing here, I am basically using the practices, the principles of somatic experiencing as a lens to look at the practices of Western Vipassana. Now in this case, it was my own experience combined with primary texts by the main writers in the movement. The thesis of the dissertation is that meditation for those with a history of trauma may not be a great idea. It might be a bad thing. And I say it like that because the last year people say, what's your dissertation on? And I'd say, what's on meditation and trauma? And almost universally people would say, that's so great. People work out so much stuff on retreat. And I'd say, well, actually, I'm kind of flipping that and saying, maybe not, it actually might be making things worse. So if I was to try to say that a little bit more eloquently, Vipassana meditation may unknowingly elicit dissociative states for those with a history of trauma. Somatic experiencing would say there are particular principles or processes and mechanisms that are evoked in a person when they have an overwhelming experience, when they go through that. To heal from trauma, we need to address these mechanisms, and meditation not only doesn't do that, it might make things worse. Now, where this will get complicated, and I think this will get fleshed out a bit in the conversation, is that mindfulness is still an important part of healing from trauma. But I'm going to talk about the way that it can come together and actually make matters worse. Is that clear? Does that make sense? Okay, good. The flow of the presentation is that I'm briefly going to talk about the lens of somatic experiencing and Western Vipassana. And then I'll go right into the two main findings that came out of this study. And then I'd like to get right into the discussion, because that's what I'm most excited for. First, however, Jorge, this past week, he said, this is your chance. Like, you can make this, give some context to the audience and tell your personal story. So in the spirit of CIS, I'd like to spend most of the remainder of the presentation talking about my relationship with my mother. She's a double Aries. And I think she's a 4. No, I'm not going to do that. But I am going to tell 2 stories. And all of this gets back to a quote that I'm going to put at the top of the board here. By the way, Robert, can you hear us okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. A quote that I'm going to be returning to over this presentation that actually really sums up like a core thing in my life that I've been working with. And the quote is, truth, like love and sleep, resents approaches that are too intense. So I have 2 stories. The first is in my early 20s, I somehow became convinced that I needed to go on a vision quest with a man named Robert Johnson, who's a student of Carl Jung. And this was his last vision quest, and it was held in a private island in northern Ontario. I'm born in Toronto. And I put it on a credit card with money I didn't have, and I went up there and I was surrounded by the top Jungian therapists who were doing dream work, and then you'd go on this vision quest. And a lot of people were like, who is this kid who's up here taking himself really seriously? Over the course of I was going to get it or I was going to die. And Robert, who was in his, I think, late 80s at the time, he's passed away, he came up behind me, and he has one leg, and I heard him coming up, shuffling behind me. And he said, he came up and he whispered into my ear, he said, if you had a little bit more fun, this whole thing would go a lot quicker. And then I turned around, he winked, and he walked away. That's all he said. It's the last thing he ever said to me. And I'm still chewing on that one. The second is that I did a clinical degree in Vancouver in Canada. And in the clinic, we had 2-way mirrors. So my first year of clinical supervision, I'm seeing clients, you know people are watching on the other side of the mirror. And the first session that we had of feedback, this amazing clinical supervisor, his name's Michael Adler, I was so nervous, and he said, you're doing great, you're doing really great. If I had one piece of advice, it would be to make a little bit less eye contact. And I went back over the video, because we had the video, and sure enough, I wasn't blinking. I was completely locked, like a double Scorpio, on my target, and it wasn't making things necessarily better. Okay, the reason I'm mentioning these stories is that a huge question in my life is how can I make personal and social transformation the most important, serious venture that I could ever undertake, and at the same time not take it too seriously, to the point that I strangle the life out of it and make it a task. So I want to relate this then to, this is how I stumbled upon trauma theory and trauma therapy, which is Peter Levine uses the myth of Medusa in his most recent book, In an Unspoken Voice. This was like the magnum opus of his work. And the myth of Medusa is that if you look directly at Medusa, you freeze or turn to stone, right? Levine says it's the same thing with trauma. If we go directly at it, we risk re-traumatization and we risk immobility. And that's what I've learned, like all the courses I've taken on trauma theory and practice, was that there is a sweet spot. There's a middle ground that you have to be able to find as a clinician. And that is his basic approach, which reflects well in my life, of trying to find that middle ground. A Buddhist reading of that could be, what's the right effort? What's the right tension here between too much and it's not enough? Finally, I want to say this is the personal experience I did have on meditation retreats informed this study. I went on long-term meditation retreats, really immersed myself in Buddhism, and was on a 6-week retreat, and in the middle of it realized I was completely out of my body, and would leave retreats actually much more dissociated and out of my body than I was before. And friends were always a little bit confused, like, you know, you don't seem much happier after your retreats. So that's where this inquiry all came from. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit first about somatic experiencing. Like, what are the things that I pulled out of somatic experiencing to use as the lens which to look at Western Vipassana? If we're going to talk about somatic experiencing, we'll talk about trauma. And the easiest way to start here would be the basic triad that many of us know, fight, flight, and freeze. Most people have heard of that, yeah? Levine expands this to include arrest, fight, flight, freeze, and then fold, or collapse into helplessness. One of the examples that works well for me around this is the cheetah and the gazelle that we've probably all seen on nature videos at some point. So you might have experienced this when you're walking and you come across a gazelle or a deer. The first thing that the gazelle will do is stop, pupils dilate, and it's orienting, like, what's that sound in the bushes? Am I in danger? So that's the first thing, right? We stop, what's going on? If the cheetah leaps from the bushes, then the next line of defense comes in for the gazelle, which is either I have to beat the cheetah up to try to survive, or I need to run. Most likely it will run. So the gazelle takes off across the meadow, adrenaline floods the system, blood to the extremities, heart rate goes through the roof, gazelle's running. And then, and this is the part of the video that you might have seen that's so amazing, if the gazelle realizes it's going to be caught, if it's imminent that the cheetah's going to jump on the gazelle, it completely freezes and drops. Have you guys seen that in the video ever? And this is this mechanism of freeze that we have. Now, I won't talk too much about fold, but if the cheetah was about to then eat the gazelle would collapse into helplessness. Freezes tight like this, and then there's fold, I give up. Freeze, we all have this mechanism, and it's such an amazing mechanism. If you can imagine the energy it takes to be running full steam 30 miles an hour across a meadow and then stop and slow the heart rate down. It's an amazing amount of force that we have to be able to actually freeze. This freeze, and this is getting into the heart of trauma therapy here, this freeze has deeply protective mechanisms that we could talk about for days, but I'll mention 3. One is if the cheetah suddenly thinks the gazelle is dead, it might think, oh, the meat's rotten, it's spoiled, and it walks away. The gazelle gets up and walks away. The second, the gazelle's frozen, the gazelle is dragged back to the lair of the cheetah, to which to do more hunting. Cheetah goes out, gazelle gets back up, runs away. Third would be, if in the case the cheetah is going to eat the gazelle is spared the intense pain of being eaten alive. It's like a get out of jail free card. Now, the interesting thing for this discussion is that the gazelle doesn't need to go to therapy following this event, right? The gazelle, and there's videos of this, it's amazing. Well, sometimes maybe, in California. I don't know. There's amazing videos of this. The gazelle will get up and then do this amazing thing. We'll just shake it out and then walk away. None the worse for wear. Perhaps a little bit wiser, like, okay, I'm not going to be drinking out of that water hole later, but can walk away untraumatized. Now, if we shift into how does trauma happen, I'm going to now define, well, what are we calling trauma? What is colloquially known as post-traumatic stress disorder? And I'll give 2 definitions here. The first is the Holy Book of diagnostic, anyone? Diagnoses. This is now the 4th revised edition. 2 conditions here. The person experienced, witnessed, or was confronted with an event or events that involved actual or threatened death or serious injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of self or others. Second, the person's response involved intense fear, helplessness, and horror. Now, Levine, it's similar to this, and it's also a little revised, and he says this, he sums it up in 2 sentences. 1, trauma occurs when we are intensely frightened and are either physically restrained or perceive that we're trapped. We freeze in paralysis, or we collapse in overwhelming helplessness. Again, we could talk about trauma for days and how they came to this definition, but I'm going to talk about what Levine says would be the key to understanding trauma, and that's what's called the fear-immobility cycle. So, like the gazelle, there's an arousal, there's an unsuccessful escape, fear and helplessness happens, and then immobility. Now, what Levine says is that what can happen is that immobility becomes paired with fear and helplessness. And what can happen here is that, say a week after a traumatic experience that didn't get to complete, we'll talk about that word complete, someone is feeling their body and they experience feelings of freeze, which would be something like heart rate's down, I feel a little collapsed, I can't breathe. If these 2 have become paired, then what that begets would be fear and helplessness. Something's wrong. I'm scared. The loop here, though, is that with more fear and helplessness, we have more freeze, right? More freeze begets more fear. We get caught in this cycle. And essentially what's happened here is we have, I'll use my hands, but we have a very natural response to an overwhelming experience. A tremendous amount of energy gets kicked up for fight or flight. But then over top of that, we have this pairing of immobility and fear and helplessness, which doesn't allow us to actually complete the original response to trauma, to the overwhelming experience. I'll give you a story on this. There's a couple people here from a group that I train with, and it's called Cymatics and Trauma. The teacher's name is Stacy Haynes. Stacy tells this story about being on Fell Street, and a family was walking out into the intersection, and a car blew through a red light. And the mother grabs the kid and pulls the kid back onto the sidewalk. Now this kid is filled with adrenaline, right? Really intense event, and starts to shake and is like, oh my gosh. The mother, instead of letting the kid just shake, gets down in front of the kid and says, stop it. You need to stop it. Stop that. And so the kid, and you've probably all seen this to some degree, does this, right? Shaking, and then goes, and stops. And so that initial response to trauma doesn't get completed. That's terrible news. I mean, when I see that, I could just go hand my card and say, call me in 10 years. It's awful to see that. Stacy saw that, she was like, oh, that's awful. People walk around in their trauma response, and this can be like decades old. Have you guys seen people walking around like this? Right? They're scared, like there was some kind of terror thing that happened that didn't get completed. So here are 2 things about the fear-immobility cycle that I want to mention. 1, this fundamentally challenges any idea that time will heal all wounds, right? we get caught in this, it can go on for decades if it doesn't complete. Second is that there's this feeling we can't complete what is a very natural response to an overwhelming experience. And when I've met people that have had trauma, in my own experience, it leads to often a very frustrating situation where there's something happening down here that doesn't get to complete. And this can create a lot of alienation from the body, a lot of self-hate. It can be a really difficult cycle to get in. It can really tear families apart. This is where trauma is a very real thing. One of the things that comes up for me is, and I've often thought about this, why don't I just complete that before bed? Like when I fall asleep, I tend to twitch, which has been annoying in my life, but I'll have these shakes. And I thought, why don't I just let the trauma run? Well, here's 3 reasons that we tend not to do this ourselves to complete a survival response. One would be, we don't know it's going to end. And I hear this from clients all the time, and you might have had this experience where someone says, I don't want to go into this, because if I go into this, I might never come out of this. And that's it's a real feeling, to feel like if I step in, I might not come out. The second, and this is so interesting to me, there's a very good chance that when you come out of a freeze, you will be violent. That's a tremendous amount of energy that if it got capped by the fear and the immobility, there's a tremendous amount of energy that remains in the body. This is the kind of energy where you see videos of mothers picking up cars off their kids. When the freeze comes, there's a good chance, and there's a couple reasons for this in the wild, that you'll spin, you'll shake, you'll cry, and that risks connection with people around you. It's pretty scary to actually let that survival response run through your body. And the third reason here, and this is why I asked Robert to be on the committee in particular, is that we're in a culture that tends to shun the expression of big emotion, right? It's like, just kind of keep that in, like the mother and the kid. So, somatic experiencing is suggesting, SE is, I'm going to say SE sometimes for somatic experiencing. SE says, here is a particular, in this book, here is a ingredient list, here's a methodology of how you actually uncouple immobility from here and untangle trauma. And I went through a year and a half of a course, and I feel pretty familiar with the material. And I'm going to draw out 3 things that I think SE is saying that applies to this particular study. The first would be, we need to start with this. We need to start with uncoupling immobility from fear. We need to do that, second, in a safe environment with another person, hopefully with another person who's trained. And third, we can't do this all at once. The analogy used in SE is, if we had hydrochloric acid and lye, and we combine them together, there'll be an explosion. If we did it 1 drop at a time through beakers, it will sizzle and it will be done. So that is the method of somatic experiencing. We can't do it all at once. We need to do it with someone who's trained. Is this making sense so far? Okay, good. Okay, so now that I've talked about what was the lens, I'm going to talk just briefly about, well, what is the Western Vipassana movement? It's a specific branch of Theravadan Buddhism. It's flourished here in the West. It's quite popular. Here are some of the core characteristics. It focuses on mindfulness, which many of you have heard of. I haven't been here for like 8 months, and there's mindfulness posters in every bathroom, like mindfulness groups, and it's still going strong. That's great. So, mindfulness, as taught primarily by a teacher named Mahasi Sayadaw in Burma. There's an emphasis on metta, or loving kindness, dana, or generosity, and the third, or the fourth, and this is one reason why I think there's a growing popularity of Western Vipassana movement, is that there's a ton of connection with Western psychology. More than half the teachers are psychologists themselves. There's a real openness to insights from Western psychology. Again, this is being very brief, but teachers go over to Southeast Asia. They come back in the mid-70s. 3 primary teachers, Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, Sylvia Boorstein, they opened the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts in 1975. they have the Dalai Lama come, and there's a bowling alley in the basement, and there's this great shot of the Dalai Lama bowling a strike. He bowled one strike and then he walked away. And he never came back. So they open this great center, and then a split develops where primarily it's led by Jack Kornfield. Jack Kornfield comes west and he opens Spirit Rock. Now this split is a fascinating one, and it gets back to this middle ground, which is that some people in this, and I'm going to call it the WVM or Western Vipassana, some people in this group said, we need to stick with exactly as the teachings are. We need to be very rigid. And there was other people that said, we need to incorporate all the amazing stuff that's happening all over this country, especially at Esalen. And so a group went west. Now it's not surprising, it's the East Coast people that are holding down the old text and the way it should be. And it's the West Coast folks here at Spirit Rock that are like, meditation and dance. And they have a New Year's party. Now, both are great. I think there's been, in the movement, both are completely necessary and they hold attention within the movement. So again, lots could be said about Western Vipassana. Here are the main things that I want to emphasize. Vipassana meditation is centered as one of the main practices. Mindfulness meditation involves non-judgmental, respectful awareness towards the body or sensations, branching out towards thoughts, feelings, and then ultimately the Dharma, or the truth, the way of things. This is typically done on day-long, 2-day-long, 10-day retreats or longer. And on these retreats, these retreats are done in silence, and this typically involves walking and seated meditation. And there's interviews on these retreats that are held approximately every 2 days for about 10 to 15 minutes. Out of curiosity, how many people in here have sat on a retreat? Okay, great. Okay, I don't know how we're doing for time, but that was all context. That was just setting the context. And now I'm going to go right in to what are the two main findings, and it shouldn't take too long. Here I'd say are the two main questions that somatic experiencing raises with Western Vipassana. One, how can you effectively work with trauma? Specifically, how can you work with this, the fear-mobility cycle, on retreat? And second, how does the impact that's created on silent retreats impact those with a history of trauma? So one I'm calling the Medusa Problem, which we'll talk about, and the second is the environment. Okay, I'm going to start with the Medusa Problem. Jorge helped me with this. He's like, this is probably the main, if you were to take one thing away from this presentation, this would be the main thing. You go on a meditation retreat, the first thing that you're asked to do is to pay attention to your breath. They want you to still your mind. And so you're asked to choose what is like a neutral object. This could be the abdomen rising and falling. It could be the sensations of breath coming in out of your nose. And that's the start of things. So recall a couple things. With SE, we have fear that's linked with immobility, and the breath is often linked with immobility. If you feel the breath, you are probably feeling the way that you are holding or that you're frozen if you have a history of trauma. Here's an important point on this. Levine says, we assess threat based on both external but also internal cues. So if I look out, I'm tracking, and I see the cheetah, or I see the car coming, I can look out and assess threat. However, if I feel my body, and what I feel is that I'm holding my breath, or my legs are really tight, some part of me is also saying, there's something wrong. What's wrong? And I start scanning the environment, like, well, what's wrong? I don't see it. When you ask someone with a history of trauma to pay attention to their body, most likely, pretty quickly, they will feel where they're frozen. They will go right to their freeze. The Medusa problem, right, is to say we can't go directly at it. We can't look directly at it. We need help to titrate back and forth. So meditation in many ways is a setup. It can be a setup for people that haven't explored their body and who have a history of trauma. Levine's original premise was that trauma is a vortex. Like our brains are wired to figure out, is there something wrong? If we pay attention to our body and there's a cut, it will go there. It's like, well, there's something wrong. I need to pay attention to this. If we're meditating and we feel that our breath is constricted, the brain will likely keep going there and be like, well, there's something obviously wrong. Here's how Levine says it. To become self-regulating and authentically autonomous, traumatized individuals must ultimately learn to access, tolerate, and utilize their inner sensations. Here's the important part. It would, however, be unwise to have one attempt a sustained focus on one's body without adequate preparation. So that's kind of the punchline of this. So really here, premature focus on sensations risks re-traumatization. Is that making sense? We'll get more, okay, good, we'll get more into it. Here's the second thing that, this is where I brought in my personal experience. If you run into Jack Hornfield on a retreat, that's great. There's great stories in most recent Vipassana literature where Jack Hornfield is working with someone in a really great way using his skills around trauma. There are trauma therapists in the Western Vipassana movement. However, if you don't have a trauma therapist, likely you're working with someone whose primary way of relating to you will be through the lens of traditional teachings. The traditional instruction is take it back to the cushion, right? It's like, be mindful of that. That's the thing that teachers have taught. It's 101. It's like, when in doubt, just tell them to be mindful of it. I would be on retreat and I'd be dissociating, I'd be having a really hard time. I'd go to the teacher and the teacher would say, can you be mindful of that? I'd be like, well, I guess. I'll try. I'd take it back. I'd be mindful of the sensations of collapse or of immobility. And eventually I'd just completely check out. So here's what I would say is the best case scenario for people going on a Western Vipassana retreat in this movement. You get a teacher who's trained in trauma therapy. They work closely with you over the retreat. They monitor your practice, and you get a little bit of extra individual attention. At the end of the retreat, if you didn't already have them, you get resources. Great. The worst case scenario, and that's who I feel like I'm speaking to here, would be you end up on a retreat, you're completely dysregulated, you're really spun out, you're caught in the fear and immobility cycle, you go to teachers, they can't hold you, you end up feeling bad, you have shame about being a bad meditator, you stick it out, but you end up having a terrible experience and you never go back. That's one of the worst case scenarios. Okay, the second issue is around the environment. For those of you who have been on retreat, a meditation environment is amazing. It's such an awesome container. People coming together collectively in silence. In the Western Vipassana movement, you take agreements around precepts, around not harming each other, about like how are we going to be together to make this a transformative space. It also tends to be a very particular culture that gets set up. There's a great story about Thich Nhat Hanh that I heard, that he came over in the 80s to a retreat, and he watched a retreat, and at the end of it, the staff were like, how are we doing? What do you think? What do you think of our practice? And he said, you guys, you're great. Your equanimity, fantastic. Concentration, it's great. And I wonder, why is it that you're walking around like senior citizens? Where did you get the idea that to be a meditator, you have to like walk like this? He just scratched his head. And I'd say that's an ongoing debate within the movement of like, well, what does it look like to be spiritual? And there's for those of you who have had this experience, there's total competitions on retreat of who can walk the slowest. And also, I've been caught in buffet lines for like 20 minutes of people like reaching, lifting. It becomes a bit of a joke. That's not a bad thing. It's just like inheriting this idea. It's very complex, right? It gets into Said's notion of Orientalism. It's like, how did we receive traditional teachings, which we might get into in the discussion. Okay, SE says, for someone to work with trauma in a contemplative environment, we would need these things, two things. This is what I think. We would need an environment where we feel safe and we can attune with another person. And we also need an environment where we're able to modulate our level of arousal. And I'll talk a little bit about that. On the first one, my experience clinically is like you can never underestimate in any transformative work the power of being able to attune to another person. This is like core attachment stuff. We need people. I'm in a group of people that are looking at trauma and social justice, and as much as we don't want to need each other, we need each other to actually heal. We'd rather just do it alone in our rooms, but the power of being with people is amazing. Of all the clinical studies I've read of techniques and how do we do this, it all seems to come back to the relationship people have with their therapist or their coach. I have a couples therapist who says, your primary task in the first 4 to 6 months of falling in love is just gaze. You guys have this experience when you fall in love, all you want to do is just stay in bed and look at the person and just gaze endlessly. And when I see my friends who are falling in love do that, I want to puke. And at the same time, that is their task. Their task is to look at each other and say, are you here? Are you here with me? Are you going to stay with me if things get bad? Has anyone seen Tom Hanks' movie Castaway? Right, so he's trapped in a desert island alone. And this is why I put this ball up here. And Wilson, the ball, becomes this primary, it's like the second main protagonist in the film. He draws a little face on Wilson, which is what the research says, that's all we need. We actually just need a face, because from the bed in the crib, I can't make it a lot, but as long as there's eyes and a mouth, I'm all right. And there's this scene in the film where Wilson, I think he gets like out to sea, and it's like, no, Wilson! Running out to try to save him. And so this is an example of how important attachment is. Okay, now on retreat, you can imagine, I'm sitting on the cushion, I'm looking around, I'm like, well, I guess I'm safe. But basic social safety cues, like someone looking at me and smiling, they're not there. The culture of Western Vipassana is the senior citizen thing mostly, like very downcast, we don't make eye contact with each other, and that's not to say that's a bad thing, but what it does is it takes away the ability for me to see that I'm safe on one fundamental level. The second question here is, when I do see a face, it's that I'm seeing the teacher at the front of the room during the instruction of a Dharma talk, or I'm having a 10 to 15 minute interview. Essie would say, is that enough? Is it enough for someone who's trying to work through trauma on retreat? Now, as a little caveat here, Western Vipassana movement doesn't advertise, come on the retreat and you'll work out your trauma. So I think we're going to tease that out of like, well, what do they mean by healing? What is enlightenment? Does enlightenment mean healing? So I'm going to open that to the floor if any of you want to throw in on that. Okay, second thing quickly, optimum arousal. There's a woman named Pat Ogden who works in a methodology called sensory motor psychotherapy. She says if we're going to do good trauma work, we have to have clients in an optimum window of arousal. They can't be hyper-aroused, they can't be hypo-aroused. You probably know people hyper-aroused who might have had trauma, and they're tracking. They're really up and they're like, how's it going? What's going on? I'm constantly vigilant with my environment. Or you could have people who are hypo-aroused, who actually will just like walk out in the front of the street in front of a car. They're not really there. To do good trauma therapy work, you need to have people in what's known as an optimum window of arousal. To do this, most people need help. It's like the primary task of trauma therapy is that you have someone with you who's helping you experience your body and sensations and teaching you when you're going into hyperarousal and when you're actually in what she calls a zone. The main role, I did somatic experiencing training, and Robert and I talked about this. It's a critique of SE. I am being trained almost primarily to track the nervous system of clients. The story, the narrative, not as important as how is this person's nervous system doing. I'm tracking an animal. So it's a particular approach to healing, yeah? And the primary role of a trauma therapist is helping people modulate and track their arousal. Again, the question on the environment is, if you're trying to learn how to regulate your arousal, will that work on a meditation cushion? Like, can you do it? And if you have an interview only every couple days, is that enough? That's really just the question. It's an open question. Okay, summing up. Recommendations, limitations. Did I write down? Yes. Recommendations. 2 primary recommendations. If everything I'm saying holds water, here are 2 recommendations. One is, let's ensure that everyone in Western Vipassana has some kind of basic competence in trauma therapy. At least enough that they can see when someone is spinning out in immobility or fear, and they know when they're over their head, right? Like they can identify, oh, that person in the 3rd row back, I think they're really spinning. How'd the interview go? Let's make sure we have actually just a basic level of competence in trauma therapy. Now, I want to add, Spirit Rock has done this, and they're often at the cutting edge of this. Spirit Rock is making sure all their teachers go through trauma training. Often this is somatic experiencing. So this is not new in some ways. People have not written about this, but somatic experiencing, Western Vipassana is one place, Spirit Rock is one place this is being done. Almost there. Okay. Finally, second, my recommendation is have a registered psychotherapist on retreats. In the Bay, you throw a rock, you hit a therapist. I'm sure there's many people that would love to be on retreat and holding space for the group. It just seems like a no-brainer for me. Why wouldn't you have one person there who, if someone is spinning out, they get individual attention. The teachers are holding the collective space for the whole group. Why wouldn't you have one person there who the teachers could recommend, like, yeah, go and see David or John or Jane. 2 limitations of this study. One is there's a lack of empirical evidence here. I'm not generating evidence. This is preliminary. I'm raising some ideas. I want to see what you guys think and the committee thinks about whether this holds water. And the recommendation here, if this is of interest, would be to do some really solid qualitative work over the next 5 years that would start to tease out people's experience, talk to teachers about what they see as the relationship between meditation and trauma. It could be a call for future research. Second, this is a narrow scope of study. I looked specifically at somatic experiencing, which is a contemporary approach to trauma. Western Vipassana is just one thread of Buddhism. Whether this is actually generalizable to trauma theory in general, to Buddhism or meditation, I leave that up to Jorge. I've been trying to figure out how to conclude this all week, and I still don't know. So what I want to say is, I want to say to the audience, I am still totally on board with Buddhism and meditation. Contemplative practice in general, I love it. This is in no way trying to say meditation is bad. This to me is, this whole study was in the spirit of, let's be a part of a conversation that continues to grow, become more integral, and can better serve people who are going on retreat. You know, I see Spirit Rock in a conversation right now where they are turning a lens on themselves. And they're like, how are we doing? There was a book by Reggie Ray written a couple years ago called Touching Enlightenment. And Reggie's awesome. And he said, and it's so powerful because he was a student of Chogyam Trungpa, and he said, you know, I've been meditating solidly for 30 years, and so has my community, and I actually don't know if we're transforming. I actually don't know if we're that much happier. And here's my take on what's missing. Reggie's take was, the body is missing. We're thinking about the body. We're not actually in the body. And he has this beautiful book on that. There are some teachers in the movement that are like, let's just stick with what we know. Let's just stick with the books. And this is the continual tension in the movement. And so I offer this all as a, just wanting to be part of the discussion of an integral form of Buddhism that is in really good service of the people that are going on retreats. Thank you. I also knew that the department, they said they were just coming for the presentation. So thanks for commenting.
We'll email you all our questions.
Ash, just to Jorge would be great.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll just 1 minute as this movement in the room, and also to give you a little break after the presentation, and then we'll proceed with questions. Robert, normally I invite the external member to go first, and then the second member, and then I would go at the end. Is that okay with you?
Okay.
And the idea would be to, as you know, to comment on the dissertation in general, anything you want to say, as well as have some time to ask any question you may have about the work.
Okay.
So let's take a few moments silence to give you a little break. And, yeah.
To allow your comments.
check it out.
Wow.
Ready?
Yes.
So Robert, whenever you want, you
Okay.
can start.
Well, first of all, David, can you hear me okay?
I can, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it was a pleasure hearing you speak. I thought that you covered the topic beautifully. I know you're also aware of what needs to be added to it to make it an even more comprehensive presentation, which I hope you'll one day put forward in book form. Also, while you were speaking, I kept having the phrase intimacy come, because you didn't mention it, but a lot of what you were talking about seemed to imply that. For example, when I'm working with trauma, the way I approach it is to create a sense of intimacy with whatever is traumatic in that person, whether it's level of sensation, feeling, contextual, whatever it is. Because in intimacy, there's a sense of being very, very close to your subject. So you get data you could not get otherwise if you're more distant. And there's also a sense of subtle distance, just enough of removal from the subject that you're studying or being with, the person, to keep them in clear focus. And that's the essence to me of a really healthy relationship. And of course, that's necessary to really do trauma work skillfully and successfully. Is there's the presence of the therapist, the caring, the safe container, the capacity to get really close to what's most troublesome, and yet keep just enough space to keep an eye on it, to move in and out of that, and to not just focus on sensation, but also feeling. I think you know this is what's missing, I think, from both systems you're describing is more of a clear focus and commitment to working with emotions at a very deep level. Because we can focus on sensation forever, and there's movement in that, and it's good. But when we take into account a person's history, their feeling state, their relationship with each of their emotions, we have a broader, deeper picture of them.
Yeah.
And when I do trauma work, I mean, the emotional part is huge, as is the body part. It's not just me sitting across the room suggesting different things to do with the body. A lot of it is hands-on, very subtle, very skillful, sometimes very deep. It's always intuitive.
Yeah.
And I think there's a sense as you gather more and more data, more and more information on these topics, you'll find yourself becoming more and more at home with just working intuitively.
Yeah.
Having a sense of when to go deep, when to back off, when to go for emotional release, when to just focus on the mindfulness aspect of it more.
Yeah.
I think that's all there. I also think a key emotion to consider here is shame. I mean, when you use the word shame once, I think it was very appropriate. I mean, if someone doesn't really feel better at the end of a Vipassana course, they'll tend to not fault the teacher or assistant, they'll fault themselves. You know, then there's a sense of shame, failure, and a sense that the only thing they can do is meditate harder, do more mantras, listen more closely to the teacher, instead of digging into the psychological and emotional dimensions of what's troubling them, which of course in part is what a good teacher ought to be tuning into and encouraging.
Yeah.
I also I was struck by your final sentence in your dissertation. It was quite interesting. You ended with a question. If the Western Vipassana movement knew that they could enhance the safety and effectiveness in the transformative nature of contemplative practice, what would be the delay in doing so? What would you say the delay would be?
That's why I asked it.
Okay.
I,
What's your sense of
I
it,
mean,
though?
my sense is that this system is set up so that movement is slow within this group, almost like within a political system. That I think that people that are pushing for change bump up quite quickly against traditionalists,
Yes.
or people that think we just need to stick with the basic foundations of mindfulness, and that's enough.
Yeah, and as long as that element is not addressed deeply, then it will continually sabotage the efforts to make this a better enterprise.
If this is another reason I wanted you on the committee was of, well, Jorge's written about this too, but of spiritual bypassing.
Yeah.
It ends up being a bypass for a long time.
Yeah, because we can. I did retreats back in the 70s and early 80s, and I was struck by how often someone would really be having a hard time, and the teacher's response is always along the lines of, "Watch it. Just keep watching it."
Yeah.
And without any sense that this could increase dissociation, could increase traumatic internal responses.
Yeah.
There was no capacity at that point. And I still think what's needed in both movements you've highlighted is more of a clear focus on emotion.
Yeah. Can I say something on that?
Oh, yeah.
We talked of this a little bit last year, but I did, the audience doesn't know, I did 1.5 years of training in Somatic Experiencing, and it's supposed to be a 3-year training to become the certificate. And I left for the reasons that you talked about, where I felt like it wasn't actually cultivating enough of a sense of intimacy. Like it could be quite formulaic in the approach that we're just nervous systems, we're just walking around. Yeah, we have our histories, but let's focus on this particular, almost like a formula. Like if we do the formula, people will heal. And what I left that for was a tradition that included social justice. Like we need to also look at fundamentally the ways that we're in relationship with each other. And we need to look at the way that people are impacted by institutions, that people have different histories.
Exactly. So whenever we work with deep fear levels in a client, we always take into account collective fear.
Right. And that wasn't being done, I don't think,
Yeah.
enough.
You're talking about Stacy's work?
I am. Yeah, that's Stacey Haynes' work. And so there's we can talk about changing individuals, but also what are the collective shapes that we're in, the collective bodies that we inhabit. And I wanted to say something about shame too.
Sure.
Which is, and I still have a lot to learn about shame, but one of the things I'm learning is that with shame comes a sense that I was let down by my people. Like I sense that someone was not there for me. And that's where it also seems like shame is a place we just naturally need to actually join with other people. And I don't know if you want to talk about
Well, the trouble is, though, is that for most of us, usually when shame kicks in, we often don't recognize that it's even there. It so quickly can mutate into aggression, withdrawal, dissociation. If we can stay with it, and to stay with it, you have to know it well, you have to be educated about it, and not just intellectually. Once you recognize shame, when it kicks in, you can work with it. But implicit in that, you see, is becoming intimate with it, getting close to it. And shame is a very unpleasant state, so most of us want to run the other way as fast as we can.
Yeah. Do you know any good Vipassana teachers who work well with shame?
No. You know, I've just got a book contract, do a whole book on emotion, and one of the key things I'm going to work on in that book is shame, because it's the most overlooked emotion in my experience the last 30 years in psychotherapy and spiritual practice. And if we don't have a real handle on our own shame or on what it means to shame another, we're handicapping ourselves a lot.
Yeah.
Can I say one more thing before you mentioned anger, how if someone comes unfrozen very quickly and it's not handled well, it can explode into really heavy rage. But there is a role for anger and trauma work. Have you had any sense of that yourself?
Can you say more?
Well, fear tends to disempower us, contracts us. It's like it's a fist, and when there's an expansion of the container, there's an opening. Anger can arise. Same adrenaline, but different directions. Instead of shrinking, there's a sense of movement, for better or for worse. And I've often found when people have a lot of fear, when they do move into anger naturally, in a skillfully guided, the body work, the breath work, the psychotherapeutic direction, that anger liberates. It isn't just an emotional masturbation. It's actually a liberating force, and often it is what had to be repressed during the original trauma time.
Yeah.
So that anger emerges, but it has to be handled very well. If it's repressed, it just creates more fear. If it's overexpressed or expressed too soon, it backfires.
Yeah.
But I see many people come alive with anger to such an extent that in a split second that anger can mutate into incredible grief, incredible joy, because it's a passion. They're alive, they're vital, and they're no longer being held hostage by their trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's not how we start off, but I see that can happen at different points during trauma work.
Yeah.
And if anger is made wrong, here's where you go back to the Western Vipassana tradition. Buddhism has the unfortunate habit of trashing anger. I've seen it happen so often where anger is equated with ill will, aggression, even violence. Often the same word is used in the old texts.
Uh-huh.
So there can be a problematic orientation toward anger in a lot of meditative disciplines.
Yeah.
And I think part of the work is to bring anger out into the open. Say, you know what? This is dangerous stuff, but it also can be incredibly powerful, life-affirming material.
Yeah.
Let's become more intimate with our anger.
Yeah. I'd like to say something on that.
Sure.
When I first got to California, it's nice to say this. What happened? I went and did a lot of holotropic breath work because that was part of, it's part of the tradition here at CIS, and I went, and it felt very akin to primal therapy. Like I was told, just move it, get it out, and hammer it out. And I kept having the experience like, oh, I'm shaking a Coke bottle, and it's blowing it off, but I'm not actually getting to any kind of deeper root.
Well, there's an assumption about those practices, rebirthing too, that emotion is just an endogenous mass, this thing within us, and we can get it out of our system. But we can't, because emotion also involves cognition, social factors. It's not a noun, it's a verb. And we can feel better if we blow it off, but I've never seen anyone benefit from doing intense cathartic hyperventilation sessions.
Right.
It backfires a lot.
Yeah. My sense of as a clinician too is that when I work with someone around anger, and if it's done in the way that you're describing, in what feels like a titrated, skillful way, it's beautiful, but the stakes are also very, very high, because there's such a potent amount of energy available to that person, and it needs to be held with a lot of care and skill. And I still have a lot to learn around that. Of how to hold someone in that.
There's such a point, I think, of the different groups we do, the week-long groups, where someone comes really alive that way and just puts his or her foot down, and then at that point, anger and joy are blended into an emotion I call exaltation. There's just a sense of being really alive, no apologies, no self-consciousness, and it's worth the effort to get there.
Yeah. That's great.
Do you have any other question, Robert?
Let me just see.
Or comment, or...
No, I think, David, you've got something really remarkable here. There's more to go, but you've got the foundation laid.
Thank you.
I hope you take this further. I see books. I see you working in this field more and more, incorporating body and emotion more deeply, and this is a fantastic start. And I appreciate how fluidly articulate you were in your presentation.
Thank you.
I didn't hear any freezing taking over. You channeled that well.
Thank you.
Okay.
Optimum arousal.
Optimum arousal.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much. I want to say to the audience, those of you who are interested or in Robert's views about anger, who I think they are really groundbreaking in many regards, this wonderful article in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. I think it's called Transpersonal Approaches to Anger. Is that right? So it's available here in the bookstore, in the library, and it's a great article. Includes the critique to the Buddhist approach to anger, and I think it's totally groundbreaking work. That I think it's based in your dissertation in Saybrook. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Did you publish that as a book?
Yes, there's a book on anger. It's not nearly so academic, so it's more accessible, of course.
Great.
And what I'm doing now is I'm writing about it in an even more conversational way.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Artie.
So I want to start out just commenting on you. Michael and I sat in a cafe before this event talking about the kind of strange evolution of dissertation defenses. And I was thinking of my mentor, Norman O'Brien, who gave this wild talk in New York around 1966 to the Phi Beta Kappa Society. He said that dissertation defenses have just become so namby-pamby. He said the Tibetans are the ones that know how to do it. You either, if you have really learned Tumo, you go out and sit by a front of the lake, and you either do it or you die. So during your presentation, I was saying, well, now where's the meat of this rite of passage? And as I listened to you, I realized the meat of it was what I hope the audience will join me with, is I think you did a really great job of showing what a great teacher you are. I thought that your contactfulness, your humor, your wit, see all of the heads nodding, you see? I think that it was really quite a wonderful passage into what a good teacher that you, teaching career you have ahead, because you have it's knowing from the inside of how hard that is. It's hard to be engaging, right? Isn't that hard? Yeah. So I think you did a really great job at that. I really appreciated that. I've loved working with you. I found it such a joy to work with someone. What I just said about your teaching applies to the way you were a student. That your clarity and your dedication and your intellectual clarity about these matters, which are deeply important. You know, we know enough people in our life that are deeply affected by these problems, and it's heart-wrenching at some point. So I so much appreciate the way you did this. And because I liked it all so much, it was problematic for me. I said, well, what on earth am I going to say today? Because I don't know where to go. So I was thinking of various things as you went along about where the doors open for inquiry. And one of the things that struck me about this whole business is the profound microcosm here of what this institute's about. So I think most of us are here because we sensed in our lives of transformation gaps between important bodies of knowledge, and gaps that were separated sometimes by strange human biases. So part of the project of the Institute has been how can we find what we think are complementary ways of getting together. And I think in that inquiry, which one of our struggles here, I think many of us struggle with, why can't we do it better? And so the question that kind of formulated that I think you have some insight in that's very important. I've been puzzled a good part of my life about why is there a lot of bias against psychotherapy in the transformational world. There's sort of in many places there's sort of a dismissal of it. It's kind of a little too unspiritual or something like that. I don't quite understand it. So it's part of what you're addressing in a way. And Jack at Cornfield has been so great in addressing that at Spirit Rock. I'm just curious about how you see that question.
Could you say a little bit more about what are the two? You said, sorry, psychotherapy and...
Oh, I think that there are various things. I think there's the world of psychotherapy, there's the world of meditation and spiritual practices, and then the worlds of body therapies, and then within psychotherapy there are various schools of thought.
Yeah.
Body therapies, there are various schools of thought. Meditation, there are various schools of thought.
Yeah.
So in the Institute, we're always working these crossovers.
Yeah.
And I think one big chasm is the relation between spiritual practices and psychological work.
Yes.
Deep psychotherapy work.
Yes. So Jack Cornfield's most recent book, Wise Heart, that was like the central text for me to work with. And what was interesting for me is that he could weave those two worlds together beautifully, but done in a way that wasn't very overt. He didn't actually say, I'm weaving these two things together. Hey, look, you know, in this moment I'm pulling on my psychotherapeutic training over here. And that's actually a critique I have of him, is if I was to read Wise Heart, I'd think, oh wow, this strain of Buddhism right now is very it's very integral,
Interesting.
and that he didn't actually, my concern would be the skills that he's espousing aren't actually being disseminated to people that are coming up in the ranks to teach.
So he's not out as a clinical psychologist.
He's totally, I don't think he's at all. I think he's in, yeah.
Right.
Depends what room he's in, I guess, but I don't know what he's doing.
Well, go ahead, keep going.
Well,
So why does he do it? Why not? I mean,
it's, my sense of reading his book was to say, we are becoming this is my main critique. Cornfield's saying, we are a catch-all tradition. Come one, come all.
I see.
We will work with you
Uh-huh.
In an effective way.
I
And
see.
when he's writing these vignettes of how he works with people, I think he's pulling on deep psychological training. But I don't, it almost comes off like, this is how we teach in this tradition. And so my concern is, has it been actually systematically laid out of, this is the way you would work with people if they come in traumatized?
I see.
Like in A Wise Heart, there's lots of examples of people that are totally traumatized, and he's working with them, but not overt about how he's doing it. It sounds like it's a part of Buddhism.
So one conclusion I would draw from your work, you're saying this, is not exactly what you said here, which in some ways is to support the one-way thing. You expand one way, but it's more to create a more collaborative model, where you have a person who's actually a psychotherapist, and everybody knows the psychotherapist is around, something like that, where there's a lot, and I think that's an interesting model. I think too often in the integral model, the integration's at the level of ideas, so the same people get more ideas. Whereas it seems to me another approach is to have more people involved with different expertises, so there's more team. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense.
Because the training is so extensive. I mean, to really be good at this, which you're finding yourself, it takes a lot of training.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other question that I want you to play with or thought about is, everything now is trauma, a lot. So, are there other kinds of dysfunction that your work applies to? So you talk about expanding the trauma model, but I'm wondering if expanding the dysfunction model. Yeah.
I don't have enough competency in.
Well, I know you don't. Right? I'm just asking you to speculate. And for this reason, I think that there are a lot of dangers in the spiritual tradition that involve kinds of other dysfunctions.
Yes. Yes.
Some of which are organic. Some of which are like in the realm of schizophrenia.
Right.
So they're kind of different dysfunctions. I'm just curious. I just want you to speculate. You don't have to have the evidence.
Okay.
You don't have to have your dissertation on that done.
I'll try to answer that a couple ways. And I'm interested in how this is being played out right now. So Spirit Rock and other centers in Western Vipassana, they will screen at this point. You'll have a basic form that you fill out when you get to the retreats that asks a series of questions, but mainly flagging, have you ever attempted suicide? Do you have any addictions? And I understand the spirit of that kind of inquiry. Now, here, this is where it feels appropriate actually to bring Andrew Ratti into this conversation. Andrew was in this a very tenuous place, I think, between what was a spiritual emergence, but also could be categorized as a spiritual emergency. And he was being, he was receiving diagnosis of is he experiencing bipolar or what? That model of the DSM or that kind of diagnosis wasn't necessarily working, and he kept landing in these different, different pods that we have here at CIS to deal with people who would be in another state, simply diagnosed, but he was being held in a much more, I think, just a very sensitive way as to what he was going through, especially because he had such a deep spiritual path. So I would be cautious of saying that meditation you could work with someone who is diagnosed as bipolar, or that you could bring in schizophrenia. And yet there are people here in the Institute who have been working, I think, at that edge for a long time. And if I'm right, Stan Grof had this spiritual emergency clinic or group that has since fallen off. And so there seems like there's an area to be occupied now for people that have gone deep into spiritual path. Their problems, what's coming up might be overtly spiritual. They don't want to go just to a purely clinical place and be diagnosed. But who are the people that can work with those that are at the intersection? Like one of the gaps that you're mentioning of what needs to be added here for people to get the support. Because at the end of the day, I just would want people to be safe and actually be able to do transformative work. But safety would be the main thing. So I'm open to suggestions around that, of like, what is that middle place?
Thanks. You have a future.
Thanks, Don. So, yeah, I mean, I agree with what has been said about your teaching. I mean, there was a fantastic presentation and very engaging, and Optimum Arousal embodying, and as well as we haven't really said too much about your writing. The writing is fantastic. Has been such a pleasure, and this is why the folks from the Center for Writing here at CIS, I think they came because when your dissertation draft reached the technical editors, I mean, the technical editor wrote me. It's the first time I have that happening ever, telling me like, this is amazing. You know, I had just to spend so little time with this. It's only just one page of technical edits, and what a pleasure to read this work. And I experienced the same. I think it was a pleasure to read your work, and so I'm also very happy with the theoretical framework. I teach theoretical research here at CIS, for those of you who don't know, you know, like Robert mentioned in his feedback, and also you openly admit in the dissertation you clearly identify the limitations of your work. So it's clear that this is a preliminary conceptual theoretical work that is calling for empirical and qualitative research. So, but that's explicitly and I think very eloquently explained in the work, you know. So, but as the theoretical part of it, I mean, there's always room for improvements, right? But I think you did a superb job, you know. It's like a very systematic application of a lens, somatic experiencing, and other trauma theory upon ethics, you know, in this case, Vipassana practice, you know. So systematic, well justified, the limitations are clear, so I think it's an exemplar of a theoretical dissertation for our department. This other wing, which I'm very excited about your work in the context of the Department of Physical Psychology, that is where you work. One of the main areas that we labor in our department is that kind of like a critical dialogue between the Western and Eastern traditions, Western psychotherapy, Western psychology, Eastern praxis, you know. Now that this dialogue has expanded into the indigenous and also many other directions, but this was, and it still is, one of the cores of what we do, and I think this work is exemplary in that kind of how that dialogue is not only possible, but it's also necessary. And it's necessary because it can help to alleviate unnecessary suffering. And I think that's the most important value of your work. I mean, the work itself answers the so what question immediately in your face. You don't have to ask so what, as it happens in many theoretical works. Right? It's like, punchline is in your face, right? But why this is so important in terms of practice and value. And in a way, it's a beautiful paradox because in a way I find even though the work could be seen as kind of like a limiting some of situating or putting some warnings around the medicine that the Buddha gave, right? That was meditation, mindfulness. That's the medicine that he gave to everybody, you know. And but in a way, I feel the work is really aligned with the spirit of the Buddha, you know, that is the alleviation of unnecessary suffering. So I think it's a beautiful point and paradox here in terms of your engagement with Buddhism, and I know that has been very alive for you. So I also love the work is experientially grounded in your personal story. That I think this is what a lot of you know, we want to see in the CIS scholars practitioners, that your work is not only as astute and intelligent and valuable, but also personally meaningful for you, and is grounded in your personal experience and your personal trajectory. So I think that's another way in your work. It's really, really great. So as I was like preparing myself for your defense, reading your work again, and I was experimenting the same problem that Don had, in the sense that it was hard for me to find like really hard questions, because many of the questions I was having, you address them here, you know, and in the conclusion chapter, limitations. So what I'm gonna do is like to engage you in discussion more creatively as a scholar, because that's who you are. You're becoming. You are really the threshold. So one thing that that for me is also like a cutting edge in my own inquiry, and I want to just bring it up here. And you know, there is a way in which in the Buddhist practice, you know, we talk about. You talk very eloquently about how, you know, the mental mindfulness on the body, you know, can elicit traumatization with population of with an unhealed history of trauma, right? Also, you brought into the picture the work of Reginald Ray, you know, and anyway, what for me is striking, and I think that comes from my own lived inquiry, is like that there is a difference between the mindfulness of the body and what I've called bodyfulness, the awareness of the body itself, emerging from the body, not from the mind or consciousness into the body, but from the body itself. And I think that Reginald Ray's critique of Buddhism goes in that direction. So I'm wondering, in that distinction, how do you engage that distinction in the context of your work and also trauma theory? Is there something about that distinction, the context of trauma theory, that you can put into dialogue for us?
That's
great. That's a great question.
Reginald Ray's, for those of you, that's a great question. The main critique of this book, Touching Enlightenment by Reggie Ray, what I understand him to say is exactly what you just said, that we're thinking about the body versus being willing to let the body reveal our bodiness, and that's what the Buddha wanted. And he does this amazing critique, like a political critique of the way that Buddhism in the West has become commodified in many ways. It's a for-fee, retreat-based thing. And he was a student of Chogyam Trungpa, and he, as far as I know, was always considered a bit of a radical, a bit revolutionary. And he's now left Shambhala and then has said, we have lost the revolutionary spirit of Buddhism. And that in the traditions that many of these teachers like Jack and Sylvia trained in, the monks, when they felt like Buddhism was becoming too institutionalized, would go to the forest and they'd leave. They'd be like, you guys sold out, I want the truth, I'm going to go to the edge and literally live in the forest and open to truth. And Reggie's take on this is, our way to do that would be to enter the forest of the body. And this is where holistic sexuality and East-West psychology, it's almost like the soundtrack of that work is, let's enter the mystery of the body and be willing to not know. That to me is like the beauty of Buddhism, is I'm willing to not know what this experience is. And that's the beauty of holistic sexuality too, for me, is what is this body? What is this experience? If I don't go down the path that I know well, what is this experience of this body? So now I got totally off. I just got excited about it.
Could I just add a point to this? Because this clarifies a point I had about Robert. One of the things you said, Robert, which is, if you notice, Robert took what you were saying as leaving out emotion. But if you go this direction, what comes out, rather than if you're going in this other way,
Yes.
is the whole business, is the whole person, not just its discrete sensations.
Totally. Yeah, so I would take this work and say, I think this would be for the people who are entering by thinking about the body, like starting. Do I want to say that? Here's I'll back up a bit. Here would be my critique of Reggie's work. Would be that he's saying all you need to do is enter the body, and it'll all come. Whatever the tangle is, it will untangle. The critique for me was, in this framework, that might not necessarily happen without a little bit of guidance from someone. Or a lot of guidance from someone else. But I don't know if Reggie has trained a group of people to simply be in their bodies and enter the forest without being conceptual. I wonder if this work would have the same meaning for that group as it was for those that are entering the body through the realm of the mind. That's an open question.
I do think he would, because I think Peter went that way himself and still found the problem. That's what I think.
Still, it could be a question that can lead to another dissertation. Take notes. All the students in the audience. No, seriously, I think that your work is very seminal in that way. So you open the door for a line of research.
Yeah.
A whole line of research that is very important, that needs to happen. And if not you, I hope that other students take your work further, you know, in doing qualitative and empirical work, because it's very important. I have a follow-up question. In the conclusion chapter, you include a very interesting section on the use of touch. Use of touch, and I think that that came out of your dialogue with Robert, and or maybe also, with Dawn too. Good. Fine. So I'm wondering, like, you know, like, I too feel that, of course, the use of touch is crucial, you know, for deep healing, and that's also where I've been working, you know, with holistic integration, holistic sexuality work for many years, and but I'm wondering aloud, like, if that, what are your thoughts about if this could be part of the resistance or the in terms of many of the Buddhists? I mean, Spirit Rock is very unique. I mean, Spirit Rock, but even in Spirit Rock, you know, I have friends who are teachers there, like Donald Rothberg, you know him, and I know you know Robert too, you know. So he would tell me, still even there, you know, there is some issues around touching, you know. Even in some of the workshops they do, there is like, and in general, the tradition, there were some clearly anti-body, anti-touch biases embedded in the tradition, you know, that is part of the change in American Buddhism, you know. But I'm wondering what are your thoughts in the sense of, like, if you were going to speak to, you know, meditation habits or leaders of Shangas here in America, you know, like around an introduction of like effective way to heal with trauma, and they may ask you about touch, and how do you sell them this? How do you approach this conversation to them, or what are your thoughts in this?
That's great. Yeah, when I gave the first draft, I think it was to you, Don, the first question that came back was, where's touch? Where is touch in this? And gosh, there's lots to say. One image I had when you were talking was that there's a number of times on retreat that I just wanted a hug.
Yeah.
That's all I wanted. And I would have cried for a half an hour, and then I would have moved on. You know, I would have gone to the next thing. And instead I spent many sittings just being like, I just want a hug. And I feel like there's many times in the room where I'll look around and see, like, if someone was able to come and actually just make, like the contact we do in your class, just make contact, safe contact with shoulders, it would totally allow things to move. And Robert, I think I don't know if there's touch in your groups, but...
a lot.
Yeah.
It's also very crucial to be aware of what age that person is.
What age?
So someone's done some incredibly deep early grief work. I can tell by the tone of voice, their movements, roughly what age they are. So from my wife Diane, so we will hold the person in that context. And again, there's no preset methodology. That's what I wanted to say earlier. I think if you're going to work really deeply with people, you have to go into it without your previous knowledge in the foreground. You want to kind of be an open space. I often say to groups, it looks like I'm leading this, but I'm actually being led by your energies and intentions. My job is to stay tuned into that. So I'm reading it constantly.
Yeah.
And there's an intimacy in that. And that intimacy generates a remarkable sense of safety without trying to do so.
Yeah. This is
But
where
I do think, on what Don was saying, I think it's crucial to include the body. I'm still shocked at how many psychotherapists, psychologists don't really include the body in a very strong way.
Yeah.
They'll take it into account, really want to get in close. And I can't imagine working with someone not taking into account their body, as well as just psyche, emotions, spirituality, mind, everything.
Do I have time to say something?
And I think the framework, if I would recommend you look at, is truly integral. It doesn't have to be a Ken Wolverian type of one, but one that's really integral and say, how do I sense all these different dimensions of what it is to be human, and how do I sense the best way to approach these, knowing at the same time they all operate together.
Yeah. One of the reasons it didn't show up right away in the writing is this comes at the intersection of so many different bodies that have so much baggage around touch. Like psychotherapy or Buddhist spirituality, that there's just like, let's just leave that over there on the shelf. And so to actually write well about this means occupying like one of those intersections that you're talking about. But the work that I do, my friend Gazina's here, and the work with Stacy is, if we were going to do touch around people that have trauma, and I think Robert's talking to this, we would have to be deeply attuned to that person, know what they care about, and we'd have to build a certain amount of trust in the relationship over consistent, trustworthy experiences built over time to be able to then move towards touch. But if it's done well, I see it opens so much so fast, and we need it.
But wouldn't that be a challenge in the context of the recommendation? That because in you're recommending people come for a 1 month retreat, and in that time, there is, or sometimes 1 week retreat, right? And there's no time for the trauma therapists in retreat to build that relationship, right? But still touch seems crucial, even for those interventions, right? So there must be, I don't know, I think it's just an open question for everybody, there must be a way.
I'm curious what Don and Robert think about this. If I was to go on a retreat having done what feels like enough work, silent body work would be exactly what I need with someone who is holding it in the context of my life, or even with trauma. It could help me move things quite well.
It could, but it's like the odds are pretty high that some sound would need to emerge.
Maybe a sound.
If I'm working your diaphragm, your jaw in a certain way, and there's a certain memory kicking in, we're playing with that. You may find that it's actually counterproductive to keep quiet. You had to keep quiet when you were little when things were difficult, but here's a chance to actually get congruent. With voice, feeling, movement, everything. So in that, there's an unpredictability to really highly skilled body work. It's not dangerous, but there's a creative element to it.
I have a different perspective that you reminded me of by the example you talked about in my class. I think there's a whole level of interpersonal work that's very simple and day-to-day, like saying hello. That would involve touch, like you said. I think that to go into a group of people where you actually have a simple touch, in say the class, it changes the environment. It doesn't have to be deep. I don't have to know who you are. Anything. So it creates much more of a sensual matrix that seems healthier. So I think that there are levels of going into touch. The first one being quite simple, actually. That's like your example of wanting somebody just to give you a little hug, They don't have to know who you are and all your pain and all that stuff, and release anything. It's just you want to.
I'll pay them for it.
That hug.
Like I remember, to me, one of the huge cultural changes that I saw in my lifetime is after the Vatican Council, where suddenly the Pope introduced handshake in the Mass, and suddenly these dead churches all over the world, people, for that moment, they came alive and shook their hands, Just that hunger to shake a hand. So it's hunger that's there.
So maybe hug meditation is the answer.
That's why everybody goes to Alma, oh my God. Just lie your head down.
So, guys, this is a wonderful conversation. I feel we could continue here for forever, but I do want to leave some time for the audience, and also the three of us will need to deliberate. But I do one last. It's not a question. It's more something we have been talking. It's Don, Robert, David, and I have been for a while talking about a more proper subtitle for his work, because as it stands now, the work is Somatic Experiencing is the lenses, and Vipassana practice is the text, but the title is Hermeneutic Study of Somatic Experiencing and Western Vipassana Movement, as if it was like two texts or two in the same foot. So finally we came with a different subtitle, and there will be like a hermeneutic study of Western Vipassana practice from the perspective of somatic experiencing. And David agrees that it's better, and I just wanted to get your consent before moving forward.
I would say a hermeneutic study of somatic experiencing to reform the Western Vipassana. Bold! That is never that big.
That's great. Robert, what do you think about the revision?
To what Don said, I'd say ditto.
Wonderful. Do any of you two, Robert, Don, has anything else to say or comment before we, the three of us? Robert, now we will go to the hallway. We'll call you from a cell phone and we'll talk briefly among us. But before we do so, do you have anything else to say, or you don't, or your lingering question, or?
Well, just thank you. I really appreciated being part of this very much.
Okay, great. So maybe then we'll disconnect here, and then we'll call you like in 2 minutes from the
Okay, so I'll hang
hallway.
on now.
And then in the meantime, this is your time to engage David also with your questions and comments, and hopefully we'll be back for part of the interaction.
Unless Robert has long criticisms we haven't heard yet.
So, okay. So it's here.
You should be there.
Hola? Oh.
Does anyone know what we're supposed to do now? Ask you questions?
We get to ask you questions.
Or we can do comments.
Comment.
I just want to say, you know, I followed your research for a while. While you were talking, I just get really, it just brought to light this experience I had in a Vipassana retreat 14 years ago, and it was like one of the most difficult times in my life. And I like totally like what you're talking. I never thought about this, but I'm like, that's what it was. I was like getting into this dissociated state, and I just couldn't go back into it. So I just want to thank you again for your research and emphasize how relevant it can be.
Question about your thinking of it as a rite of passage, and having known maybe your process more personally. I'm not sure that I've totally heard you.
We
You can put it on speaker.
oh, here.
Yeah.
Oh, I think
Did you hang up on them?
yeah.
We did.
I'm sorry to say,
Yeah. Let me.
There you go.
we
It's on
decided you
speaker.
didn't pass.
It's on speaker.
So that he can hear. Oh, he okay, that's great. Thanks.
Oh, you want it back?
I don't know if he'll be able to hear from here. Can you hear us?
So I'm going back on.
Yeah. Yeah, that'd be great.
Sir. Same as just.
Hi, you've reached Robert and Diane.
Maybe it's because he's connected to this.
Yeah.
After the tone, please leave your
Should we leave him a message? I'll try one more time.
Yeah.
And then if not, we can just.
Hello?
Hi.
Hey, Robert, you there?
Yeah,
Okay, you're back.
yeah.
So we're gonna hear like some questions from the audience next maybe 10 minutes, and we'll be handling.
Yeah, so the question was, have you stepped in, like, I heard that this could be very important. This could be a career. There's a lot here. Have you stepped into it, and do you want to? Like when I hear this, I'm just very curious. Like, do you want to step into this? I'm sorry, I know it's maybe not a fair question, but it is a rite of passage.
This
Hold
is
you
his
to
job,
it.
this is gonna ground it.
Yeah, right.
But it is a rite of passage. Do you?
Yeah.
What is the rite of passage?
The truth is, what I carry forward from today is much more around the relationship of cymatics to social justice, and interested in the union of personal work with social transformation, the combination of those things together. And I came down here, I was having a lot of trouble when I was preparing this. I noticed that I would get really tired when I was talking about Vipassana. Like I just try to skip it, and I wasn't that engaged with it, and was much more drawn to the trauma piece. And Vipassana got me down here. Like I came to the Bay because I thought I wanted to be a teacher at Spirit Rock, and I was convinced that was my path. And I bumped into Jack Kornfield the third month I was here. I was hiking at Spirit Rock, and he came up the trail, and I was like, "This is Jack Kornfield." And I said, "I know your son." And I was like, he doesn't have a son. And he looked at me. And I said, I'm at CIS. And he said, "That's great." And then he kept walking, and I thought, I totally blew my chance to say hi. And all I wanted to say was thank you for his work. But someone, Kathy Ann, was saying, oh, it was all of this came from the fruits of meditation showing me what I was missing. And that was the rite of passage for me in all this was being alone on those retreats, and kept coming back, and then taking that and bringing that into this process. Like that was the rite of passage for me. And then writing back to myself at 18, so that I wouldn't have to go through this again somehow. So I'm less inclined, I don't want to be that psychotherapist on retreat, and I don't have a lot of juice right now to write this for Vipassana people. Like I'm much more interested in different intersections. But it felt like this feels really like my life on the board of what I went through.
Very quickly, I want to add that what I do find that still is really important is that your work gets out in the Buddhist communities, because already you have a piece published in the journal Somatics, so the somatic practitioners already know about this, but it feels paramount that the Buddhist communities get to know about this. I know we tried already to publish in Tricycle, in Vipassana, it didn't go through, there was some, but I think we should keep trying. Because, it feels so important that, short essays, out of this work, easy to write, you have it already written, and just get out there,
Okay. Write that down here.
Any other, maybe one or two more questions in the audience, or comments, or?
A couple of questions. First of all, beautiful presentation, and your passion and connection to the work just clearly comes through. I mean, I could have listened to you do a whole day or weekend on this, just because it was so pleasurable to hear you integrate everything. And beautiful job. So, first question actually comes a little bit related to that. You said that your rite of passage came through the Vipassana, and possibly not getting the touch on the shoulder or the hug you needed. And my question, it comes back to something I ponder actually, constitution. Early in this state, a lot of people want to change things, but then there's also, there's a sense of brokenness, or something that could be better, but then there's also a sense that, could we be avoiding something by changing these rules, like changing the United States Constitution, or changing the traditions that have been passed down for so long? Do you feel like on some level we're avoiding something by doing that, or could we be missing out on that painful stepping in that you did?
That's a great question. I mean, I feel like that's the tension within the movement, is people that are, it's a really compelling point to me of we need to hold firm. These traditions have been around for 2,600 years for a reason. Let's not be so self-centered to think that we now have, let's just tweak it this way, and maybe we should just have 30-minute sittings instead of blah, blah, blah. It could go on. And so I think there's a really compelling case to be made for, we need to hold firm to traditions that we received from another part of the world. I totally agree. And I hammered my head on the wall for 5-6 years saying, if I just do it by the book, there will be transformation. And this is where I think Reggie is so radical to say, look, genuinely we've been doing meditation practice for a long time, and we're not much happier. Like, we're actually not changing. And so to have the audacity of saying, let's turn back on the tradition and see, do we need to do something different? And the 2 points he makes is, the text might not have known this social context. It just couldn't have imagined of how disembodied we would be at this point. So maybe we need to actually tack on some things here to make this teaching more effective. But then it gets into all the messiness of, this was in the dissertation, people come down hard on those teachers. Like Jack Kornfield is written off on a number of fronts for this plateau spirituality. Like, oh, you're saying that we're not going for enlightenment, we're just going to go for, life is good enough, we have good relationships. And he gets slammed for not keeping with the traditional notions of enlightenment. So that seems like the ongoing tension. And for me, I haven't been on retreat for 2 years. That's just my choice, because it's not working for me. But I think I could end up getting some medicine that would then have me go back there and have it be an amazing place. I'm just saying, for certain people at a certain time, it may be not the thing for them. But I still think there's deep value in people holding firm to the tradition. And I don't think that like a Vipassana and dance party is necessarily what needs to happen. Like Jack did a holotropic breathwork and Vipassana retreat that he had yearly with Stan Groff. That's radical, might work for some people. So I'm open, but I do see the value in let's make sure that if we do shift this, we're really sure, because there was a good reason those traditions were in place in the first place. So.
Well, I think that what Jorge said to you earlier is a very relevant point right here, which is the Buddhists talking about relieving human suffering. When we're talking about people like Andrew and other people we've known in the serious limit situations that come to it, seems to me we need to think about those carefully.
Yes.
And not just say, oh, we just keep doing this.
Right.
It's not just how do we feel better, but how do we really relieve human suffering.
Yeah, for one, when I look at any tradition, I see a lot of chains. I mean, any tradition, Buddhist tradition, what's the Buddhist tradition is chains. Mahayana, the Tibetans, the Theravada, so why not more chains in the contact with, this is what the proponents of American Buddhism are saying, is the fourth turn of the wheel, it's like a different emerging tradition here in the States, and I do frankly believe that that's how it will be seen, like, let's say 100 years from now, perhaps even less, I don't know, for one, I do believe that the future of spiritual practice will include somatics, will include emotional work, they will be really integrated. In ways like, we have like these paintings of the planets and the cosmos here in this room, and it's like, it brings things into relativity, we're like such a, how many, 2,000 of years in our history of human species is nothing. We're giving baby steps in spiritual practice and bring things together, So, put my visionary hat on, I feel that, of course it will be integrated, somatics, no brainer for me. Spiritual practice, but it will happen at its due moment, and I think that's your point, that those creative tensions maybe need to be there and some time until it happens, and I think your work is helping in that direction. I think it's probably time to bring to our closure. So basically, obviously the three of us are, I can speak about the three of us, we're very satisfied with the work, and we just want to congratulate you. And part of me actually feels, CIS do not have like a dissertation with honors, as other universities do have. If CIs would have that option, I would vote strongly that your dissertation would be given dissertation with honors. So I want to say this here. So congratulations, Dr. Treleaven. So now, before giving you David, and we're gonna all the forms to sign. So we do all the paperwork, and then it's for you to celebrate with him and all that. So Robert, Robert.
Yep.
So we're gonna sign the forms now. I think that